Hello everyone! Today, I'm going over a budget commander deck that I've built around Yarok, the Desecrated. As usual, I've designed this deck to list for less than $45 at the time of recording, using prices listed by Scryfall, but this doesn't include costs such as shipping. So, Yarok is a 3/5 legendary elemental horror with Death Touch and Lifelink, costing 2 generic, a black, a green, and a blue mana to cast, and has an ability where, if a permanent entering the battlefield under your control causes a triggered ability of a permanent you control to trigger, it does so an additional time. Which heavily points to ETB effects galore as a build path, where in some cases we'll be looking to have effects that would more commonly be on instants and sorceries, on permanents instead, while also aiming to have plenty of landfall effects to get triggers off of our lands entering the battlefield, and of course tons of permanents that have effects that trigger when they themselves enter the battlefield. But let's speed past this intro and get into the 99 of this deck, starting with our ramp. First up is some land-based ramp with Wayfarer's Bauble, which can be sacked to tutor a basic land onto the battlefield tapped, and Rampant Growth, which does the same, but on a sorcery. Cultivate has you tutor for 2 basic lands which you'll reveal, put one onto the battlefield tapped, and the other into your hand. And Omen of the Hunt is an enchantment that tutors a basic land onto the battlefield tapped when it enters the battlefield, and it can be sacked to scry too. But since this is an enter the battlefield effect, this would tutor 2 lands if Yarok is out. Then, moving on to mana rocks, we have Talisman of Resilience, Dominance, and Curiosity, which tap for generic, or, for the cost of pinging yourself for 1, could give you mana of Golgari, Dimir, or Simic colors, respectively. And we have the same color combos with Golgari Signet, Dimir Signet, and Simic Signet, which converts 1 generic mana into 2 mana with the colors matching its name. And finally, Fellwar Stone is likely to tap for most, if not all of our colors in a typical commander game, and then Ornithopter of Paradise and Arcane Signet will tap for any color we could need. But let's move on to the meat of this deck with a huge proportion of the enter the battlefield effects which Yarok can help us by doubling up on, starting with those that affect mana or our lands. Tireless Provisioner has you make a treasure or food token whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control. Then Cloud of Fairies and Peregrine Drake untap 2 and 5 lands, respectively, when they enter the battlefield, effectively paying for themselves, but with Yarok out, they could be a decent 1-turn mana bump. And Risen Reef has you look at the top card of your library when it or another elemental enters the battlefield under your control, of which, if it's a land, you can put it onto the battlefield tapped, but if you don't put that card onto the battlefield, it goes into your hand. And Risen Reef can trigger off of us casting Yarok, as our commander is also an elemental, so it's far from the worst thing to cast Risen Reef ahead of Yarok. Then we have a bunch of other landfall triggers, starting with Retreat to Coral Helm, letting you either scry 1 or tap or untap a target creature. Retreat to Hagra, having each opponent lose a life and you gain 1, or giving a creature +1/+0 and Death Touch for the turn. And Retreat to Khazad-dû, letting you either gain 2 life or put a +1/+1 counter on a target creature whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control. Then to help us fill out our board, we have Rampaging Baloths and Zendikar's Royal, making 4/4 green beast creature tokens and 2/2 green elemental creature tokens whenever you do a land drop. And Skewed Swarm makes a 1/1 insect creature token whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control. But it makes a copy of itself instead if you control 6 or more lands, which could get really out of hand fast. And Avenger of Zendikar makes a 0/1 plant creature token for each land you control when it enters the battlefield, and then puts a +1/+1 counter on each plant you control whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control. Now, moving past landfall, Honest Rutstein has you return a target creature from your graveyard to your hand when it enters the battlefield, and I'd consider dropping this in ramp since our creature spells are made to cost 1 less generic to cast. Gruff Triplets is a 3/3 trampler that makes 2 token copies of itself when it enters the battlefield as a non-token creature. So, you'd get 4 tokens with Yarok out, and when Gruff Triplet dies, you put a number of +1/+1 counters equal to its power on each creature you control named Gruff Triplets. Massacre Worm gives creatures you control -2/-2 until the end of the turn when it enters the battlefield, and has their opponents lose 2 life whenever a creature they control dies. And finally for this section, Endray's Forerunners is a hasty 7/7 with Vigilance and Trample that gives other creatures you control +2/+2, Vigilance, and Trample until the end of the turn when it enters the battlefield, which could be a decent way to close out a game. Now I'd like to quickly go over a few effects that are handy, but don't fit super well into the Enter the Battlefield chapter, nor the following chapters. First up, with a focus on Enter the Battlefield effects, having a few flicker spells can be nice to have, as it'll give you access to a permanent's Enter the Battlefield effect again after casting. So for this, we have Teferi's Time Twist, which slow flickers a permanent we control, exiling it and returning it at the start of our next end step, and giving it a +1/+1 counter if it was a creature. Blur is a cantrip that fast flickers a creature we control, returning it immediately to the battlefield. And Ghostly Flicker and Displace can exile 2 creatures and return them immediately to the battlefield, with Ghostly Flicker also being able to affect lands and/or artifacts. Also, given that all of these are instant spells, they could be used to bail out a creature we control from some targeted removal spells, which may be handy given Yarok is pretty likely to be on our opponent's hit list. Then Panharmonicon is like a slightly more limited second copy of Yarok, where artifacts or creatures entering the battlefield triggering abilities on permanents we control make those abilities trigger an additional time. And important to note here, Yarok plus a Panharmonicon will only cause a relevant trigger to trigger 3 times, not 4, and this is also true if you somehow manage to get additional copies of Yarok. Then Champion of Lambholt gets a +1/+1 counter whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control, but makes it so creatures with power less than Champion of Lambholt can't block creatures that we control. And Doppelgang is an X-cost spell that gives us a way to make multiple copies of some permanents we control, likely to get a bunch more of their enter the battlefield triggers, though unfortunately it doesn't remove legendary status, so Yarok isn't a great target for this. But now I'd like to move on to our various sources of draw, which will predominantly be through permanent cantrips, starting with Lembas, our only non-creature in this section, which has you scry 1 and then draw 1 when it enters the battlefield, and gets shuffled into your library when it's put into a graveyard from the battlefield. Then Baleful Strix, Tome Raider, and Cloudkin Seer are flyers that have you draw when they enter the battlefield, Baleful Strix also having Death Touch. Then Wall of Blossoms, Elvish Visionary, and Generous Stray are some green creature cantrips, with the wall being decent for blocking. Fibblethip the Lost has you draw 1 upon it entering the battlefield, but has you draw 2 if Fibblethip enter the battlefield from your library in some way, while also being shuffled into your library if Fibblethip becomes the target of a spell. Serum Visionary has you draw 1, then scry 2 upon entering the battlefield, and Aether Channeler gives you some options upon entering the battlefield, either drawing a card, making a flying 1/1 bird token, or returning a target non-land permanent to its owner's hand. Muldrifter has you draw 2 upon entering the battlefield, but it can be evoked for less mana if you don't need the body on the field. And Hydroid Krasis is an X-cost spell having you draw half X cards, gain half X life, and entering with X +1/+1 counters on it. Though notably, Yarok will affect the draw and life gain effects on this to basically have you draw X and gain X life, but since Yarok's ability doesn't work on replacement effects, the +1/+1 counter aspect of Hydroid Krasis won't be affected by Yarok. Then Coiling Oracle has you reveal the top card of your library upon it entering the battlefield, of which a land revealed this way is put onto the battlefield, and otherwise, the card is put into your hand. And finally, Tatyova, Benthic Druid simply has us gain 1 life and draw a card whenever a land enters the battlefield under our control. But now, let's move on to our interaction and protection spells. So given that Yarok is likely to draw some attention from our opponents, I'll start with some ways to protect our commander, with Kaya's Ghost Form and Not Dead After All being ways to have a creature return to the battlefield when it dies, with Kaya's Ghost Form also working if that creature was exiled. Then Shielding Plaques is an aura that gives its creature something very close to hexproof, where it can't be the target of spells or abilities your opponents control, and Swiftfoot Boots gives its equipped creature hexproof and haste. Then moving to interaction, we have Counterspell and Negate for a couple of counterspells. Beast Within and Abrupt Decay let you destroy a target permanent, with the former giving the owner of the permanent a 3/3 beast creature token, and the latter only affecting non-land permanents with mana value 3 or less. Putrefy destroys a target artifact or creature, and Doomblade destroys a target non-black creature. And then Ravenous Chupacabra and Reclamation Sage are creatures that destroy a target creature and a target artifact or enchantment, respectively, when they enter the battlefield. And then for a couple of board wipes, we have Decree of Pain and Azuri's Predation, the former destroying all creatures and having you draw a card for each creature destroyed that way, though it can be cycled where, for the turn, each creature gets -2/-2 for the turn. And Azuri's Predation makes a 4/4 Phyrexian Beast creature token for each creature your opponents control, and then has each of those beasts fight a different creature. So, you're likely to wipe a ton of weenies, and leave yourself with some leftover beasts to play with. But now that we've gone through all of the spells in this deck, let's go over our land base. First up are some land tutor lands with Promising Vein, which can be sacked to tutor a basic land onto the battlefield tapped, Foreboding Landscape, which can be sacked with no additional mana to tutor a basic swamp, forest, or island onto the battlefield tapped, but it could also be cycled if needed, and Myriad Landscape, which can be sacked to tutor 2 basic lands of the same land type onto the battlefield tapped. And then for some color fixing, we have Exotic Orchard, which, like Felwar Stone, is likely to tap for most, if not all of the colors we could need in your typical Commander game. And then Command Tower, Path of Ancestry, and Opulent Palace will tap for any color that we can need. Then moving on, we have a bunch of lands with Enter the Battlefield effects that Yarok can trigger again, including Scry lands with Zhalfir and Void, Crystal Grotto, and the Grey Havens, which enter the battlefield untapped, but mostly produce generic mana. And Temple of Mystery, Malady, and Deceit for some dual color Scry lands. Then we have some life gain lands, starting with Radiant Fountain, giving you 2 life on entering the battlefield, but also only producing generic. Then Jungle Hollow and Thornwood Falls give you 1 life on entering the battlefield, and produce Golgari and Simic colored mana, respectively. And Dismal Backwater and Jwar Isle Refuge also gives you 1 life on entering the battlefield, but produce Dimir colored mana. And then Sunscorched Desert lets you ping a player for 1 damage when it enters the battlefield. Mortuary Mire lets us put a creature card from our graveyard onto the top of our library when it enters the battlefield. And Mosswort Bridge has Hideaway 4, where, when it enters the battlefield, you look at the top 4 cards of your library, which you can exile 1 face down, and then you put the rest onto the bottom of your library in a random order. And you can play the exiled card without paying its mana cost by tapping Mosswort Bridge with 1 green mana, so long as your creatures have a combined power of 10 or greater. With, in this case, the exiled card referring to each card that's exiled with Mosswort Bridge, since Yarok would have the Hideaway effect happen twice. Then we have Rogue's Passage to give us the option to make a creature unblockable for the turn. And finally, we'll fill the rest of this deck with 5 islands, 3 swamps, and 6 forests to slightly balance our basics to the number of colored pips in this deck. But now that we've gone through all 100 cards in this deck, let's take a look at that price. And as you can see here, this deck is currently listing around $44 at the time of recording, which does include our basic lands at 10 cents each, but doesn't include costs such as shipping. And now before closing out this video, I'd like to quickly go over some cards you may wish to consider if and when you're looking to upgrade or adapt this deck. First up, Woodland Bellower is a creature tutor for non-legendary green creatures with converted mana cost of 3 or less. Double Major and Helm of the Host can give us a few ways to make non-legendary copies of Yarok. Virtue of Knowledge basically acts as another copy of Yarok or a Panharmonicon. Tribute to the World Tree can provide a hefty amount of draw or boost the power of our creatures when they enter the battlefield. And Lotus Cobra can give us extra mana for each land drop. But regardless, if you'd like to build, adapt, upgrade, or otherwise play with this deck, the link, as always, is in the description down below. If you liked the video, consider giving it a like, and if you'd like more Budget Commander decks in your feeds, consider dropping a sub. Regardless, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.